It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning. The birds were chirping, the sky was blue, and Jake Miller was feeling great. He lived in a tiny town called Shoreview, where everyone knew everyone else. To all the people who lived there, Jake was just a regular guy. He didn't talk much, and he didn't cause trouble. He had moved into a small house near the water a few months ago. It wasn't a big house or a fancy one. It was simple, with plain walls and a little porch. And Jake? He drove an old truck that rattled when it moved. Nothing about him seemed special, at least, that's what everyone thought. But here's the thing, Jake had a secret. A huge secret. It was so big it could fill the whole ocean and then some. Nobody in Shoreview had any clue. They saw him walking around in his old jeans and faded shirts, and they figured he was just a quiet guy with nothing exciting going on. Boy, were they wrong. Jake wasn't loud or showy, but he was super smart. He had big ideas and a tricky plan up his sleeve. While the neighbors peeked out their windows and whispered about his rusty truck, Jake just smiled to himself. He didn't care what they thought. He knew something they didn't, and that made him feel like he was on top of the world. Let's picture it. Shoreview was a sleepy place. The houses sat close to the water, and the docks stretched out into the waves. Boats bobbed up and down, tied to little posts. People walked their dogs, sipped coffee, and waved hello to each other. It was the kind of town where nothing big ever happened. Everyone liked it that way, calm, quiet, and boring. But Jake? He wasn't boring at all. He was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and nobody could figure him out. They saw the outside, the old truck, the small house, the quiet way he acted, but they didn't see the inside. Inside, Jake was buzzing with energy. He had dreams bigger than the tallest trees and plans sneakier than a fox in a henhouse. Every morning, Jake would wake up early. He'd sit on his porch with a cup of juice, watching the water sparkle in the sun. The neighbors would pass by and nod. "Morning, Jake," they'd say, barely looking at him. They didn't think much of him. To them, he was just another guy who didn't fit into their fancy little world. Some of them even gossiped. "That truck of his is an eyesore," one lady said, peeking through her curtains. "He doesn't belong here," another guy muttered, sipping tea on his deck. They judged him because he didn't have a shiny car or a big house. They thought he was less than them. But Jake didn't mind. He'd just sip his juice and smile, that tiny, secret smile. They had no idea what was coming, and he loved that. See, Jake wasn't just smart, he was clever. He watched everything. He listened to the whispers and noticed the sneaky looks. He knew what people thought of him, and he let them think it. Why? Because it was all part of his plan. He didn't need to brag or show off. He didn't need a loud voice or a fancy suit, not yet, anyway. He was waiting for the perfect moment. And that moment? It was getting closer every day. The neighbors thought they had him all figured out, but they didn't know the first thing about Jake Miller. Imagine you're Jake for a second. You're living in a town where everyone looks down on you. They see your old clothes and your beat-up truck, and they think, oh, he's nobody special. But deep down, you've got something huge hiding inside you, something that could change everything. How would that feel? Pretty cool, right? Jake felt that way all the time. He walked around with his head high, even when people ignored him. He didn't need their approval. He had his secret, and that was enough. Now, let's talk about that truck for a minute. It wasn't much to look at. The paint was chipped, and the engine made funny noises. When Jake drove it down the street, heads turned, but not in a good way. "Why doesn't he get a new one?" kids would ask, pointing from their bikes. "He must not have much money," their parents would reply, shaking their heads. But Jake didn't care about the truck. It got him where he needed to go, and that was all that mattered. What they didn't know was that Jake could have bought a shiny new car if he wanted to. He could have had the best one in town. But he didn't. He liked keeping things simple. It was all part of the game he was playing, a game nobody else even knew they were in. The docks were Jake's favorite spot. He'd walk down there sometimes, hands in his pockets, looking at the water. The boats rocked gently, and the air smelled like salt and fish. He'd stand there for a while, just thinking. The neighbors didn't get it. "What's he staring at?" they'd whisper. "Probably daydreaming," they'd laugh. But Jake wasn't daydreaming. He was planning. Every step he took, every wave he watched, it was all leading up to something huge. Something that would make their eyes pop out of their heads. So here's the big question for you: what would you do if everyone thought you were just a regular kid, but you had a giant secret? Would you tell them right away? Or would you wait, like Jake, and let them find out the hard way? Think about it. Jake didn't rush. He didn't shout. He stayed quiet and let the town keep guessing. And that's what makes the story so fun. Because Jake wasn't just living his best life, he was about to turn Shoreview upside down. The sun was high in the sky that Saturday morning, and Jake was ready. He didn't know it yet, but today was the day things would start to change. The neighbors kept peeking, the whispers kept going, and Jake kept smiling. They thought they knew him. They thought he was small and unimportant. But they were so wrong. Stick around, because Jake's about to show us what happens when you underestimate the quiet guy with the big secret. What do you think so far? Are you curious about what Jake's hiding? I bet you are. Let's keep going and find out what happens next. Ready? Here we go. Now, let's meet Karen Thompson. She was like the boss of Shoreview, at least, she thought she was. Karen didn't have a crown or a castle, but she ran the HOA, which stands for Homeowners Association. That's a group of people who make rules for the neighborhood. And Karen? She loved rules more than anything. She loved them so much she acted like the queen of the whole town. If something wasn't perfect, Karen was there to complain about it. She poked her nose into everyone's business, always looking for something to fix or someone to yell at. Karen lived in a big house with a perfect lawn. She kept her windows shiny and her flowers neat. Every day, she walked around Shoreview with her head held high, watching everything. If a kid left a bike on the grass, Karen would knock on their door. If someone played music too loud, Karen would write a letter. She thought she owned the place, and most people were too tired to argue with her. But then came Jake, and oh boy, Karen didn't know what to do with him. It all started when Karen saw something new at the docks. She was walking by the water, her eyes sharp like a hawk's, when she spotted it, a big, shiny yacht. It wasn't like the little boats everyone else had. This one was huge, with clean white sides and tall railings that sparkled in the sun. It looked expensive, way too fancy for sleepy little Shoreview. Karen stopped in her tracks. Her eyes got small and squinty, and her lips turned into a tight line. "What is that doing here?" she said under her breath. She didn't like it one bit. To her, that yacht didn't belong. And worse, it was parked right where Jake's old truck usually sat. Karen's brain went into overdrive. She knew Jake lived near the docks. She'd seen his rusty truck a million times and rolled her eyes at it. He can't even afford a decent car, she'd say to her friends. So how could he have a yacht like that? It didn't make sense to her. Karen clutched her phone in her hand, holding it tight like it was a superhero weapon. She decided right then and there, this yacht was trouble, and she was going to do something about it. She marched down to the dock, her shoes clicking loud on the wooden boards. The water splashed gently below, but Karen's voice was anything but gentle. She got right up to the yacht and saw Jake standing there. He was leaning against the railing, cool as a cucumber. His arms were crossed, and he looked relaxed, like he didn't have a worry in the world. That made Karen even madder. "Who do you think you are?" she shouted, loud enough to scare the fish away. "Bringing this giant thing into my neighborhood? This is my dock. You can't just park this monster here." Jake didn't jump or yell back. He just stayed where he was, calm and steady. He looked at Karen with his quiet eyes and said, "Go ahead." His voice was soft, but there was a tiny smile on his face, a sneaky little smirk that said he wasn't scared at all. That smirk drove Karen crazy. She wasn't used to people talking back to her, especially not quiet guys like Jake. She wanted him to argue or explain himself, but he didn't. He just stood there, daring her to do something. And Karen? She took the dare. She whipped out her phone and started dialing. "Oh, I'll go ahead, all right," she snapped. "I'm calling the cops. You think you can break the rules around here? Not on my watch." She pressed the buttons fast, her fingers shaking with anger. When the 911 operator picked up, Karen didn't even wait for them to say hello. "Yes, hello," she barked. "There's suspicious activity down at the Shoreview docks. Some guy's got a huge yacht here, and he's breaking all the rules. You need to send someone right now. Jake watched her, still leaning on the railing. He didn't move an inch. His smirk got just a tiny bit bigger, but he didn't say a word. The sun shone down on the yacht, making it glow, and the water rocked it gently side to side. Karen kept yelling into her phone, telling the operator all about rule breakers and troublemakers. She pointed at Jake like he was a bad guy in a movie. He's up to no good, she said. I know it. But here's the funny thing, Karen didn't know what she was starting. She thought she was in charge, like always. She thought calling the cops would scare Jake and make him take his yacht away. She thought she'd win, just like she always did when she complained. But this time? Oh, this time was different. Jake wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. He had that secret we talked about, the big one, bigger than the ocean. And Karen? She'd just done something she couldn't take back. It was like she'd lit a match and tossed it onto a pile of fireworks. Something huge was about to explode, and she had no idea. The neighbors started peeking out now. They heard Karen's loud voice and came to their windows. Some stepped onto their porches, cups of coffee in their hands, watching the show. They'd seen Karen yell before, but this was new. A yacht. Cops? Jake. They whispered to each other, curious and confused. What's going on? One lady asked. Karen's at it again, a man answered, shaking his head. They didn't like Karen much, but they didn't like trouble either. And this? This looked like trouble. Karen finished her call and shoved her phone back in her pocket. She crossed her arms and stared at Jake, her face red and her eyes burning. You're done for, she said. The police are coming, and they'll get rid of this ugly thing. She waved her hand at the yacht like it was a pile of trash. Jake just tilted his head a little, still calm. We'll see, he said, so quiet you could barely hear him. But that "we'll see" made Karen stomp her foot. She hated that he wasn't fighting back. She wanted him to be mad or scared, but he wasn't. And that made her angrier than ever. The air felt heavy now, like a storm was coming. The water kept splashing, the birds kept chirping, but something big was building. Karen stood there, thinking she'd won. She thought she'd caught Jake breaking the rules and that she'd come out on top. But Jake? He knew better. He knew the cops wouldn't be the end of the story, they'd just be the start. Karen had no clue what she'd set in motion. She'd lit that fuse, and the bomb was ticking. Tick, tick, tick. What was going to happen next? Oh, you'll see, it's going to be wild.